A major story is now emerging around the future of the British monarchy. The claim is that November 14th, 2026, has been chosen for Prince William's coronation, and the most interesting part is that November 14th is also William's birthday. Officially, such a date could be described as symbolic, a new beginning, the start of a new era, and a step toward the future of the monarchy. But when you look closely at the timeline behind this story, it does not simply look like a coincidence on the calendar, because the story is connected to a private meeting inside the palace, a meeting that, according to the reports, was not supposed to become public. Where did this meeting reportedly take place? Inside a highly sensitive private room. And who was there? Two very important members of the royal family, Princess Anne and Prince William. This is where the story becomes much more serious. Because when a normal meeting takes place inside the royal family, signs of it can often appear through public events, official schedules, or statements. But when the issue involves the future of the throne, the situation is very different. In such moments, the most important thing can be silence. And that is exactly the atmosphere that was reportedly seen after this meeting. No clear statement, no immediate announcement, and no clear explanation of what the meeting was really about. At first, there were different possibilities: security, health, protocol. But later, the story moved directly toward the future of the throne. The claim was that the meeting was not about security arrangements or a normal administrative issue. It was about succession, the transfer of power to the next monarch, and this is where the biggest claim appeared. It was reported that King Charles III stepping down and Prince William becoming the next king was no longer simply a possibility. Instead, a detailed plan was reportedly being prepared. However, there is an important point that must be understood. Public information confirms that King Charles was diagnosed with cancer in 2024. Later, it was reported that his treatment schedule would be reduced in 2026. But this does not automatically prove that he has decided to give up the throne. That is why the subject of abdication, meaning voluntarily giving up the throne, remains extremely sensitive. Because in British royal history, the word abdication carries a very heavy history. In 1936, King Edward VIII gave up the throne. That decision deeply affected the British monarchy, and since then, abdication has remained one of the most extraordinary decisions a British monarch could make. So, if King Charles were ever to make such a decision, it would not simply be a family matter. It would be a major moment in British constitutional history. And this brings us back to Prince William. Because if William is eventually going to become king after Charles, the question is not only when he will receive the crown. The bigger question is he already being prepared for that role? According to reports, William has been holding private meetings with important people for some time: constitutional advisors, senior officials, and people with deep knowledge of the royal system. The reported focus of these discussions is the future of the monarchy. In other words, according to the story, William is not simply waiting for the day when the crown is handed to him. He is preparing for that day in advance, and this is where Catherine's role also becomes important, because preparing for a possible coronation is not simply about putting a crown on someone's head. It involves months of planning, ceremony arrangements, guest lists, security, protocol, and above all, creating an image that can present a new monarchy to modern Britain. The original story claims that Catherine is also playing an important role in these preparations. And if all of this were to be true, it would mean that the end of the Charles era and the beginning of the William era had been planned much earlier than the public realized. But the biggest question is still unanswered. If the palace really has been preparing for a major change in the monarchy, why November 14th, 2026? And could William really be crowned king on his birthday? That is where this story becomes even more interesting. But now we reach the most sensitive part of this entire story. If preparations for a transfer of power are really taking place inside the monarchy, what could be the reason behind them? The answer is directly connected to the health of King Charles III. Buckingham Palace announced publicly in February 2024 that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. He continued his treatment while also carrying out his public duties. Later, it was reported that his treatment schedule would be reduced in 2026. But this is where reports and speculation began raising a new question. Could a reduction in treatment simply be a sign that his health is improving? Or could it also be connected to a possible change in his royal responsibilities? There is no official answer to that question. In fact, the available public information also shows that Charles has continued to attend important events and carry out his royal duties despite his illness. Still, reports about abdication have continued to appear. Some media reports have claimed that if Charles ever feels unable to fully carry out his constitutional responsibilities, a plan could be ready to bring Prince William forward. But there is an important difference here. Having a plan and having made a decision are two completely different things. And that difference is what makes this story so interesting. Because the British monarchy already has an established system for succession. William is currently first in line to the throne after Charles. So if Charles ever steps down, the question of who comes next would naturally point toward William. But the real question is, when? And this is where the reported palace preparations become important. According to reports, William has been having private conversations with people who could play important roles in the future monarchy. Constitutional advisors, senior officials, and experienced people who understand how the royal system works. The reported focus of these conversations is strategic planning for the future of the monarchy. This could mean that William is not simply preparing for the crown. He could also be preparing for a new style of monarchy. There has been ongoing discussion about William trying to balance tradition with modern life. But if he becomes king earlier than expected, the challenge would be even greater. Because he would not simply be receiving the crown from his father. He would be taking control of an institution that must continue to prove its relevance to a changing Britain. And this is where Catherine's role becomes even more important. William would not face this transition alone. Catherine would be beside him, and as a future king and future queen, both of them are already closely connected to the future of the monarchy. This is why reports about planning for a possible transition also mention public presentation and future responsibilities. Who would stand beside them? Who would take important roles? Which members of the royal family would become part of the future royal team? And how would the monarchy present itself to the public? These questions would all be important for any new reign. And then there is another very important name, Princess Anne. Anne is considered one of the most experienced and trusted members of the royal family. She played an important ceremonial role at Charles's 2023 coronation. And that is why her possible role in William's transition is also being discussed. If there is one person who understands the old traditions of the monarchy while also knowing how to deal with changing circumstances, Anne is certainly one of the most experienced members of the family. That is why her reported presence at the private meeting is so significant in this story. The meeting was not simply about William's future. According to the claims, it may have been about how the transition from one reign to another could happen without constitutional or public chaos. Because in the British monarchy, the priority is not simply change. It is continuity. One king leaves, another king takes over. But the institution continues. That is often seen as one of the monarchy's greatest strengths. And if Charles ever decides to step down, the palace would need to make sure that the public does not feel that the monarchy is in crisis. Instead, the message would be simple. One era has ended, and another era has begun. This could be why William's preparation is so important. A sudden transition could create risks for the monarchy. But if everything is prepared in advance, if the advisors are ready, if the protocol is ready, if the ceremonial arrangements are ready, and if the future king is mentally prepared for the role, then the transition could be presented in a very controlled way. And this brings us back to that mysterious private meeting. Because if succession really was discussed inside that room, the question is not only when Charles could step down. The bigger question is, could William's coronation date also be part of this wider transition plan? November 14th, 2026, William's birthday. A date that, according to the story, could represent the symbolic beginning of a new era. But is this date really confirmed? Or is it simply part of the reports and claims circulating outside the palace? Because there has been no official announcement confirming that William's coronation will take place on November 14th, 2026. And that is where the biggest question in this entire story appears. If the date has not been officially announced, then what is the basis for presenting it as certain? And even more importantly, if Charles has not publicly abdicated, then how far have preparations for a November 2026 coronation actually gone? That question takes us directly to the most important part of the reported plan: the accession council, the public proclamation, and the final constitutional process that would formally establish the next monarch. And if the claims are correct, perhaps the palace began preparing for this transition long before the public ever knew about it. The story has now reached the point where the reported preparations inside the palace appear to go beyond private conversations. Because if a British monarch ever decides to give up the throne, it is not simply a matter of making an announcement. A complete constitutional process would follow, and one of the most important parts of that process is the accession council. This is the formal process through which the accession of a new monarch is publicly established. The British monarchy already has a constitutional system for succession. After Charles, William is currently first in line to the throne. But there is an important difference between accession and coronation. A new monarch becomes king through the succession process. The coronation is a separate ceremonial event that takes place later, and this difference is extremely important when understanding this entire story. Because if Charles were ever to abdicate, William would not have to wait until his coronation to become king. He would become monarch through the constitutional succession process. His coronation could then take place later at Westminster Abbey. But the reports go even further. They claim that preparations for a possible transition may include rehearsals, the accession council process, the public proclamation, the role of senior officials, and most importantly, a carefully managed handover designed to make the transition as calm and dignified as possible. It may sound extraordinary, but preparing for a major constitutional transition is not, by itself, unusual. The real question is whether such preparations are actually being carried out for Charles right now, or whether they are simply contingency plans for a possible future situation. And at the moment, that answer is not publicly clear, because Buckingham Palace has not officially confirmed that William's coronation will take place on November 14, 2026. That is why the most dramatic parts of this story need to be treated carefully. Still, if the claims are correct, the scale of William's preparation would appear to be significant. It has been reported that William has already been having private conversations with important people with experience in constitutional matters, advisors who could play a role in decisions about the future of the monarchy, and senior figures who could help keep the institution stable during a transition. This would mean that William is not simply preparing for the crown. He could be preparing for a new style of monarchy. And this is where Catherine's role becomes important again. Because William would not be the only public face of the transition. Catherine would be with him, and the future king and future queen would both have an important role in shaping the public image of the monarchy. That is why the reported planning could involve much more than ceremonial arrangements. Who would stand beside them? Who would take important positions? Which members of the royal family would become part of the future royal team? And how would the monarchy present itself to the British public? All of these questions would matter for any new reign. And then there is Princess Anne. Anne's role in this story is especially interesting because she is Charles's sister and one of the most experienced working members of the royal family. She has spent decades carrying out royal duties, and at Charles's 2023 coronation, she served as goldstick in waiting, a ceremonial role. But her possible importance during a William transition could go far beyond the ceremony itself. Anne represents a generation that witnessed the long reign of Queen Elizabeth II and has also experienced the reign of Charles. She understands the traditional monarchy, and her experience could also be valuable as William moves toward a different kind of royal future. That is why her name continues to appear in discussions about the reported private meeting. But there is another important point that must be made clear. There is no official public confirmation that Anne announced William's coronation date. Still, the picture presented by the original story is very clear. On one side is Charles, a king who spent his entire life waiting for the crown. He became king at the age of 73 in 2022, and in 2023 he was crowned at Westminster Abbey. On the other side is William, still Prince of Wales, still heir to the throne, but now at the center of speculation about a possible earlier transition. This is where history also becomes part of the story. In 1936, Edward VIII's abdication created a major crisis for the monarchy. His decision left a lasting mark on British royal history. That history is one reason the word abdication remains extremely sensitive within the British monarchy. So, if Charles were ever to make such a decision, the palace would have to manage it very carefully. The goal would be to make sure the public did not see it as a crisis. Instead, it would need to be presented as a controlled constitutional transition. And perhaps that is why one word matters more than anything else: continuity. The king may change, but the institution must continue. Public duties must continue. The relationship with the government must continue. The royal household must continue working, and the public must feel that everything remains under control. That is where William's preparation becomes so important, because if he is already prepared, the transition could require less adjustment. And if Catherine is also preparing for her future role, the two of them could present a new image of the monarchy from the very beginning. But the biggest question in this entire story remains the same. Where did November 14th, 2026 come from? Because it is William's birthday. And if this date really has been selected for a future coronation, it would be a highly symbolic choice. A new king beginning his reign on his birthday. The end of one reign, and the beginning of another chapter. But once again, the date has not been officially announced by the royal family. So for now, we have to look at two different sides of the story. On one side are the reports claiming that preparations for a transition are already underway. On the other side are the official facts showing that Charles continues to carry out public duties, while reports about his treatment reduction have described it as a positive development in his recovery. So the picture is still not completely clear, but if a major announcement does come from the palace in the coming months, people will immediately look back at this reported timeline, because then the biggest question will not simply be whether William was ready to become king. The question will be, did the palace begin preparing for this transition long before the public knew about it? And if it did, then what exactly was decided inside that private room? That is the question that matters most. Now we come to the final and most important question in this entire story. November 14th, 2026. This is the date being linked to Prince William's possible coronation. And the most interesting thing about this date is that it is William's birthday. But is this really the confirmed date of his coronation? For now, the official answer is no. There has been no official announcement confirming William's coronation for November 14th, 2026. So this date should not yet be presented as a confirmed royal event. But according to the story behind these reports, it is being described as a highly symbolic date, a day that could represent the beginning of a new chapter. And if William were ever crowned at Westminster Abbey on this date, its symbolic importance would certainly be significant. Because Westminster Abbey is not simply a building. It is one of the most important ceremonial places in the history of the British monarchy. Charles III was crowned there in 2023, and for centuries, British monarchs have been connected to coronations at this historic location. But a possible William coronation could be very different from Charles's coronation, because William would be facing a different Britain, a public that may not feel the same emotional connection to the monarchy as previous generations. A generation that wants more transparency, and a modern society in which the royal family must continually prove its relevance. That is why discussions about William's possible reign often focus on modernization, less ceremony, more accountability, and a monarchy that can preserve tradition while moving with modern Britain. If William eventually becomes king, his biggest challenge will not simply be receiving the crown. He will have to maintain public confidence. He will have to show that the monarchy is not simply a legacy from history, but an institution that still has a role in modern Britain. And this is where Catherine's role becomes even more important. William's future reign would include Catherine as a central figure. Her public image, her responsibilities, and her approach could all play an important role in defining the future monarchy. But there is another major question. If Charles were ever to decide to abdicate, how would that decision be presented? Because abdication has never been viewed as an ordinary event in the British monarchy. Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 left a deep mark on royal history. That is why any decision by Charles to step down would have to be handled extremely carefully. If such a decision ever happened, the palace would need to make the message clear. This is not a defeat. This is not a constitutional crisis. It is a controlled transition. A monarch is not running away from responsibility. Instead, circumstances have led him to pass the crown to the next generation. And that message would also be important for William, because William would not simply be taking his father's place. He would also be carrying his father's legacy into the future. Charles spent his entire life preparing for the crown. He became king at the age of 73, and in 2023, he was crowned at Westminster Abbey. After that, he faced a major health challenge. But according to publicly available information, he continued carrying out his constitutional and public responsibilities while receiving treatment. Reports in 2025 said that his cancer treatment schedule would be reduced and presented this as a positive step in his recovery. This is what makes the entire story even more complicated. On one side, there are reports and claims about abdication and an early coronation for William. On the other side, there are Charles's own public statements about his recovery and continued duties. So for now, the safest conclusion is this. William becoming king in the future is part of the established line of succession, but the November 14th, 2026 coronation date and an immediate abdication by Charles have not been officially confirmed. Still, if Buckingham Palace makes a major announcement in the coming months, the world will immediately look back at the timeline being discussed today, because several questions would suddenly become important. Were the private meetings really preparations for a transition? Was William already being prepared for his future reign? Had Catherine already begun preparing for the coronation? And was Princess Anne given an important role in this possible change? The answers will only become clear with time. But one thing is certain. Prince William is currently first in line to the throne after Charles. That means that whether the transition happens in a few months or many years from now, the British crown will eventually pass to William. And when that day comes, a new chapter of the monarchy will begin. But the real test of that chapter will not be the coronation ceremony. The real test will begin after it. Can William modernize the monarchy? Can he strengthen public trust? Can he find the right balance between tradition and change? And most importantly, can he leave the institution stronger for the future than the one he inherited from his father? That is the question that a coronation alone cannot answer. The answer will come through William's entire reign. And if November 14th, 2026 really does become the day William stands inside Westminster Abbey and receives the crown, it will not simply be a birthday celebration. It will mark the beginning of a new era in British royal history. A new era in which Prince William becomes King William. Catherine will stand beside him, and the world will watch to see how strong the crown passed from Charles to William really is, and how much William changes it for the future. But for now, the crown is moving toward William because he is first in line to the throne. But November 14th, 2026? That story is still waiting for an official announcement. And perhaps that is the biggest question of all. Is the palace's silence a sign that a major announcement is coming? Or is the world waiting for confirmation of a story that has not yet been officially confirmed?